And it gets worse than that, because you remember this sink right here? We don't know where it is, so we don't understand it. We do know that everything in the universe is finite. So we know that its capacity to absorb that 2 gigatons of carbon per year is finite. So it may very well do the same thing as the ocean, and we might someday quite suddenly have 100% of our carbon emissions stay in the atmosphere. If that happened today, that means we would well over double our net emissions without us emitting a single bit more. Such is the curse of maskings. Friendly in the short run because they keep us from having the full effect, but with a serious backlash if you abuse them for any length of time. So maybe now you see why there seems to be an increasing sentiment in the climate science community that since the IPCC didn't include a number of the feedback mechanisms now being studied, its predictions of climate change, often dismissed by skeptics as overblown and alarmist, are probably too optimistic. It's worth giving just a brief explanation for each of the specific doomsday scenarios that I mentioned in the video Risk Management in the lower right-hand corner. First, seas rising 20 or 30 feet. This is due not just to the runoff from melting ice sheets and glaciers. You've heard of Greenland and West Antarctica and the possibility of them melting and raising seas so far. A lot of the sea rise can be accounted for by the simple thermal expansion of seawater. Generally, when something gets hot, it expands and takes up more room. This is actually what accounts for most of the observed rise in sea level so far. So you get a double whammy. More water from the ice on land that's melted, and expanding the water that's already there, because it's warmer. Entire forests dying and burning. I already mentioned how a changing climate can stress out the trees, leading to increased disease and infestations. But here's another way to look at it. Basically, as things warm up, regional climates will migrate, and the forests of Northern California may find themselves in a Southern California climate. They don't like that climate. That's why they stuck to Northern California. So you can have an entire forest die just as effectively as if you'd picked it up and plunked it down suddenly in the wrong spot on Earth. These dead forests stand dry, and as soon as lightning sparks, you get the next catastrophe, which is widespread wildfires, which clear the land of the dead forest, but the forest doesn't come back like it used to after fires, because all the seeds on the ground are from a different climate that no longer is there. I don't have a reference for that one. I may be just making this one up. Someone let me know. Massive floods alternating with killer droughts. This is kind of a funky one because climate change can mean the same annual rainfall, which sounds like no big deal. Here again, relying on common sense can really do you a disservice, because if the rainfall is distributed differently, it can have a profound effect on our lives. For instance, here in the Pacific Northwest, instead of getting our precipitation drizzled fairly evenly throughout the winter, we might get it mostly dumped in a month or two. Since it would be warmer, more of the precipitation than usual would be rain and less would be snow, not only causing large amounts of flooding when it fell, but reducing the accumulated snowpack. So when spring and summer roll around, there would be very little snowpack to feed the watersheds, and we end up with consistent droughts. Not only that, but a huge fraction of our electricity comes from hydropower, a carbon-free source. So we would import more electricity from the coal-fired power plants elsewhere, which would increase carbon emissions. Hey, another feedback cycle. That's pretty cool. All despite the fact that on paper, the total annual rainfall stays the same as before. The breadbaskets in the US and Russia turning to dust bowls, leading to widespread famine. This was already mentioned in the Pentagon report, due mainly to more arid soils, harsher winter conditions, and stronger winds. What was it? The carrying capacity of the Earth may be drastically reduced? Dreadful epidemics rage like wildfire. Milder winter conditions. Wait, didn't I just say harsher winter conditions? I can't have it both ways, can I? Yes, I can, because what's the name of the game? Global climate change. It's all about the disruption caused when things like ecosystems and economies are set up for the regional climates they have now, and then abruptly find themselves in a completely different climate. Anyway, milder winter conditions in some areas fail to cause the die-offs of insect larvae that usually occur, so you get markedly increased insect populations, spreading over wider territories, carrying disease for people, animals, and crops. If you combine that with the public health care system already stressed by dealing with refugees from coastal areas and the water treatment systems of major metropolitan areas being breached by rising seawater, remember how you-know-what always flows downhill? What happens when the bottom of the hill is raised up? You can see where epidemics become feasible as a result of abrupt climate change. Have you heard of colony collapse disorder? About 25% of the commercial honey bee hives in the US have suddenly and mysteriously died in 2007. Global climate change can't be blamed yet, but environmental stresses are thought to play a significant factor, perhaps by allowing more favorable conditions for parasites or fungi, while at the same time lowering the bees' immunity. This is just the type of sudden, triggered, large-scale problem that abrupt change in climate might bring about. If you think we're just talking about honey, you should be aware that commercial hives are responsible for the pollination of something like 1/3 of U.S. crop species. If you're worried about protecting the economy from harsh government regulation, think about the economic impact of losing the commercial production of 1/3 of U.S. crop species. Protect the economy indeed. Storms like Katrina can become the norm. The debate is already active about how much to attribute recent changes in hurricane seasons to climate change, but no climate scientist debates that it is plausible in the future. And none of this sounds good for the economy, does it? Still, you'll often hear objections like, why get all wound up about the climate changing? Who's to say what the right climate is? Birds and bees build nests and homes out of raw materials in their environment, just like we do. How is this different? If there were no beavers, there wouldn't be any beaver dams disrupting the natural course of a river. Is that good, or bad, or just the way it is? The climate has done fine before without us. But it's been warm in the past. Where's the evidence that that's bad? Sometimes I feel kind of chilly. My response to all of these comes down to the climate is tremendously complex. Like I said a minute ago, it's more accurate to think of global warming as global climate change and even more descriptive to think of it as global climate destabilization. I've even heard it described as global climate chaos. Maybe that image is a little less comforting than global warming. Who's to say a light tap on the chest is a bad thing? It's not, unless you happen to be balancing on top of a post. The issue is not the temperature, folks. The issue is the stability of the climate. Every human settlement is set up for the regional climate it has now. How does spinning the wheel and swapping climates at random with another settlement somewhere in the world sound to you? We've got a number of examples of ancient civilizations that have disappeared suddenly, and abrupt climate change is one of the main suspects. The Anasazi, the Mayans, the Nabateans. There is no right climate, and there's nothing morally wrong with a changing climate. The problem comes simply from the effects that a changing climate has on our standard of living. The problem is we're pretty much set up to deal with the climate like it is now. Here it seems that the greatest criterion for a good climate is predictability, consistency, so that we don't plant our crops and then have them die. We also don't tend to like extreme weather events like storms, floods, and droughts. What the best science is now showing us is that a little change in the temperature can radically change climate, making it both unpredictable and violent. That is the problem, not just a change in temperature. So it's really not about saving the planet. It's about saving ourselves and our standard of living. One objection I hear a lot is, why should we, that is America, change? China is a bigger emitter, and India is right up there. Taking action would just hamstring us economically and wouldn't solve anything unless China and India are addressed. Yes, we should do everything we can to help and prompt China and India to reduce their emissions, perhaps by developing the new energy technologies and selling it to them at a profit. But aside from that, it doesn't at all invalidate action on our part. Here's why. In a global system, bottom line, it's the total emissions that matter. And when you're playing a game that has a tipping point, where the movement from here to here is not a big deal, but the same size movement from here to here, there's no way to assign who emitted that last little bit that just put us over. Because you could point the finger at anybody and say, if you had emitted just that little bit less than you did, then the total wouldn't have crossed that tipping point, and we wouldn't be hosed. And you'd be totally correct to say that. You do recognize, of course, that they'll be saying the exact same thing to you, and they'll be equally correct. Everyone's disappointed at the guy who missed what would have been the winning shot at the end of the basketball game. But the truth is, if that other guy hadn't missed that layup in the second quarter, the game would have been won as well. And with carbon emissions, it's all going on simultaneously, so it's even more ridiculous to pick a scapegoat. So no more of this, but what about China nonsense? It's not even about the morality of chipping in or doing our part or doing the right thing. It's about doing what's in our self-interest. It's about doing whatever it takes to avoid crossing a hidden tipping point which might totally hose us. Plus, with 5% of the world's population, the US emits 25% of its greenhouse gases, so we really shouldn't be stirring up the hunt for a scapegoat anyway. Now is as good a time as any to address a common objection from those who want to believe that humans aren't changing the climate, so they go looking for evidence and stop as soon as they find something that sounds like it supports their view. I'm not making fun of that. I just point it out as an example of how you actually get farther from the truth about the physical world rather than closer to it when you start from belief and look for evidence rather than the other way around. Be sure to watch the video Nature of Science for ways to guard against this phenomenon of confirmation bias. The objection I hear is this. In the ice core data of past climate changes, increases in atmospheric CO2 concentration actually happen 500 years after the temperature starts to go up. Those silly scientists have got it backwards. That's proof that CO2 doesn't cause warming. It's the other way around. Warming causes CO2. This is exactly why I suggest we leave the analysis of the evidence to the scientists who know what they're doing. Here's the misinterpretation the skeptics are making about that data.